let's talk about renewable sources of energy. We've covered the non-renewable sources of energy and talked about energy transformation and transfers. Let's talk about ways we can use renewable sources of energy in our everyday lives. Please fill in the notes as I go along. Let's remind ourselves what renewable energy is. By using fossil fuels and nuclear power for energy, we know isn't perfect. They can cause carbon dioxide and radioactive waste. There are some other ways that we can get electricity. And we reviewed in class the non-renewable energy sources and how eventually these resources will run out. We want to invest time and energy into finding new renewable energy resources from things like the sun, water, and geothermal. Let's get specific about each type of energy. First, let's start with solar. You've probably seen some of these solar panels out and about in Carlsbad or maybe mounted on houses. Maybe you yourself have solar at home. When we talk about solar, please keep in mind the idea that sunlight energy is converted into chemical energy in a process called photosynthesis. In this process of solar power, we get a couple of different things. Let's start with first how it works. We take first by passive heating through sunlight, it heats building directly. Think of your hot car when it faces the sun. Your car heats up. So sunlight heats up directly. We can also think of it in terms of a solar water heater. When water flows through a solar collector and gets hot, it then gets pumped to the house. Solar cells are what actually makes the electricity. So think back to our energy stations when we gave you that solar fan. When you took the solar cell outside, it transformed the solar or radiant energy into electricity to the motor to power that fan. There are some advantages to using solar energy. It is considered clean energy. And the sun is free. It doesn't cost any money. And it doesn't run out. So this is a source that we can continue to use over and over again. There are considered some disadvantages to using solar energy. You need a fairly sunny climate. So if we put solar panels in Seattle, we might not get as much energy. This is why you see a lot of windmills and other things out in the desert where there's lots of sun. They can use that solar cell to get a lot of sun to collect. You also need a big area of solar cell, about 5,000 cells the size of your hand to run your house, which is a lot. It doesn't work at night either, so that's a disadvantage to solar energy. Let's talk about hydroelectric. Hydro means water, so let's talk about how water can generate power and electricity. Let's first begin by how it works. Water needs to run from a dam or a waterfall downhill due to gravity. That water moving downhill then turns a turbine, and that turbine then turns a generator. And in turn, that generator generates electricity. There are many advantages to hydropower, or getting power through the flow of water. It is considered a clean energy source. Steady supply, even at night. It doesn't run out. It's considered non-wasteful. And reservoirs make recreation opportunities and drinking water. It may control flooding, and it's considered renewable, which means we won't run out. There are some disadvantages, however, to using hydroelectric power. Dams change ecosystems, and also in the construction of these dams, they may break. They also can cost a large amount of money, and you have to have some sort of a river flowing. So areas that don't have a river will struggle with some of this hydroelectric power. The next one is biomass. Let's first talk about what biomass is. How it works. Biomass is any plant and animal byproduct that have been decomposed and burned. Wood, leaves, wood, waste, and manure are all examples. We then can also convert corn, which is another form of energy, and a gas in the form of ethanol, or bacteria in landfills, which make methane. We can also talk about paper. Paper factories burn their own waste to make all the electricity they use and more to sell. So biomass is all the breakdown of non-living and living things broken down and used to generate electricity. The advantages is it's very easy to get as we generate a lot of plant and animal byproducts. It's cleaner than burning fossil fuels, and it's considered renewable, meaning we should not run out. It can also, though, however, have some disadvantages. It makes carbon dioxide and smoke and ashes, and we don't want to use trees too fast. Geothermal is the next resource. This should sound familiar because we know that there's heating inside of the earth from the magma. Geothermal energy uses pockets of that magma close underground, and it's incredibly hot. The cold water then is pumped underground where it's heated by those magma pockets. The steam then turns a turbine, and that turbine moves and generates a generator, and in return it makes electricity. There is a lot of geothermal energy used in Iceland and New Zealand that have magma pockets close to the surface. An advantage is it's fairly inexpensive or cheap to operate, and it's unlimited as our Earth is constantly moving molten material and causing heat to occur. Some disadvantages is you have to have magma close to the surface for this to work. So that's geothermal. Tides are another example. Tides are very similar to hydroelectric. The tide comes in, and as it does that, it traps the water. As we pull that water in, it lets the turbine move, and the turbine turns a generator, and the generator makes electricity. I hope you're seeing a pattern here with many of the forms of energy, those non-renewable resources that they don't have. Renewable resources a lot of times have a natural resource that turns a turbine, and that turbine transforms the energy into electricity. Some advantages are that tides are cheap and it's also renewable, but you need very high tides and very low tides for this to work. And dams can disrupt the coastline or block boats and fish. Another example that you may be familiar with is wind power. Wind is really energy coming from the sun, which makes the wind. Wind turns a turbine, which in turn turns a generator, and the generator, you can probably guess it, makes electricity. You've probably seen some on your way to Palm Springs. We do that because there's a lot of sun there and a lot of wind. The advantages of wind power, windmills, is it's fairly inexpensive and renewable. Disadvantages, though, are most people consider them fairly large and big and ugly on the landscape, and few areas have strong enough wind and constant wind flow. Another disadvantage is they can be quite noisy, and they can interfere with communication in cell towers. The next one is called hydrogen. We can actually use hydrogen as a renewable resource. Let's talk about how it works. We first remove hydrogen, or H2, from oxygen in water. So remember, the chemical compound for water is H2O. We remove the hydrogen atom. In doing so, that hydrogen is burned into gas in an internal combustion engine. This hydrogen is a very plentiful substance on Earth. Water is 70% of Earth, so we have a lot of hydrogen that we can actually burn. Any engine can run on hydrogen without major modification, and it's a non-polluting, meaning only waste is water. So it's pretty non-harmful to the environment. Disadvantage, though, is you have to separate the H2, or hydrogen, from the oxygen, and that can be fairly difficult. It's also really difficult to store because it's not concentrated enough. A tank would have to be huge in order to store it. The last one we'll talk about is nuclear energy. Nuclear energy happens through nuclear fission or fusion. Nuclear energy is derived from the nuclei of an atom. Atoms are composed of all non-living things. They're very, very small and make up all non-living things. Most often, it is a product by a process called fission. Fission is a process where a nuclei, or center of an atom, is radioactive and they split. The energy is then released by the splitting of an atom. In nuclear power plants, the energy is used to heat water to make steam, and the steam in turn turns the turbine, which then moves the generator to make electricity. Some advantages of nuclear energy is it doesn't cause pollution because we're just splitting atoms. You can run a plant for years without having to refuel, and only 1 gram of uranium-235 makes as much energy as 3.5 tons of coal. Some disadvantages, however, to nuclear power is that nuclear plants produce a lot of radioactive waste. Radioactive waste remains dangerous for thousands of years and must be stored so it won't escape into the environment. Power plants can overheat as well, creating a possible meltdown, releasing radioactive waste into the environment. So these are all the renewable resources that cause energy to form in our everyday lives. I hope you can think some examples that you've seen about all these renewable resources.